Throughout the pages of the Bible, few nations stood in such fierce defiance of God as the Moabites. They weren't just hostile neighbors to Israel. They were a people born from sin, drenched in idolatry, and remembered for their attempts to spiritually corrupt God's chosen nation. From seduction and curses to open rebellion against the Lord, their story is one of judgment and astonishing grace. But what if I told you that from this cursed people, this nation God himself had banned from his assembly, rose one woman whose faith would change history? A woman whose name would be forever engraved in the bloodline of the Messiah? This is the shocking journey of the Moabites, the people who defied God and were ruthlessly destroyed. And yet, hidden in their dark history is a story of redemption so powerful, it still echoes through eternity. In this series, we will walk through the rise, fall, and divine rejection of Moab, and then witness the unbelievable moment when God's mercy reached into their ashes to birth a miracle. If you're ready to discover a side of the Bible most people overlook, one that combines tragedy, warning, prophecy, and salvation, then this is your invitation. Don't just watch. Subscribe to the channel now and turn on the bell so you never miss a single episode. In the ancient pages of the Bible, the story of the Moabites is both haunting and profound. Their presence weaves through the Old Testament like a shadow, sometimes as allies, often as enemies, but always as a people standing just outside the light. To understand them fully, we must return to their origin, which is not only deeply controversial but also spiritually symbolic. The Moabites did not emerge from a place of divine calling, like Abraham, or from a promise, like Isaac. Their beginning was not noble or heroic. Instead, their story began in the eerie silence after God's wrath had fallen on two infamous cities, Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot, the nephew of Abraham, was one of the few survivors of that divine judgment. Angels had dragged him out of Sodom just before fire and brimstone consumed it. But as he fled, his wife disobeyed the command not to look back. She turned and was instantly transformed into a pillar of salt. Now Lot and his two daughters were alone, their world utterly destroyed, homeless, familyless, and surrounded by the ruins of a once thriving civilization. They took shelter in a cave in the mountains. Fear kept them from staying in the small town of Zor. Isolation became their refuge, and despair their constant companion. In that cave, surrounded by silence, grief, and twisted memories of the perverse city they had escaped, Lot's daughters made a disturbing decision. They believed they were the last people on earth. Their trauma had clouded their judgment. Having grown up in a culture soaked in moral corruption, their minds were shaped by the filth of Sodom. They looked at their aging father and believed their family line would die out unless they took drastic action. In their desperation, they resolved to get their father drunk and sleep with him so they could preserve their bloodline. One night, the older daughter gave Lot wine until he was unaware of his surroundings. She lay with him, and he knew nothing of what had occurred. The next night, the younger daughter did the same. In both cases, the text emphasizes that Lot was completely unaware, a man broken by sorrow and dulled by wine. From these two tragic acts, two sons were born. The older daughter named her son Moab, his name literally meaning from the father. The younger daughter bore Ben-Ammi, the forefather of the Ammonites. This was how the Moabites came into existence, not by a calling from God, but by incest, by human desperation, and by choices shaped in the darkness of sin. It was a birth marred by shame and sorrow, a lineage stained from its very beginning. While Israel traced its roots to Abraham, the man of faith, the Moabites began with an act people would rather not speak of, a secret sin in a mountain cave. This origin story would follow the Moabites throughout history, lingering like a curse, coloring every encounter they had with the Israelites. As generations passed, the descendants of Moab grew into a powerful and organized nation. They built cities, established kings, and took their place among the regional powers. But their spiritual legacy remained broken. They did not worship the God of Abraham. Instead, they followed false gods, particularly Chemosh, a deity associated with child sacrifice and immorality. From the beginning, the Moabites chose a different path from their Israelite cousins, a path marked by hostility, idolatry, and seduction. The relationship between Israel and Moab would become a tale of repeated conflict. Though they shared blood through Lot and Abraham, their paths diverged dramatically. When Israel came out of Egypt under Moses and wandered through the wilderness for 40 years, they eventually came to the borders of Moab. But instead of receiving them with hospitality, the Moabites responded with fear and aggression. This fear was not without reason. The Israelites were numerous, and stories of their victories had spread across the region. Balak, the king of Moab at the time, saw the approaching Israelites and trembled. But instead of preparing his army for battle, he turned to spiritual warfare. He sought out a man named Balaam, a well-known seer with a reputation for invoking blessings and curses. Balak believed that if he could have Balaam curse Israel, then perhaps his people could overcome them. He offered the prophet riches in exchange for a divine curse. 3 times Balak took Balaam to different mountain peaks, hoping the higher vantage point would allow him to pronounce the curse over Israel. But each time Balaam opened his mouth, blessings poured out instead. He could not curse those whom God had blessed. Instead, he prophesied Israel's greatness, declaring their protection under the Almighty. The plan had failed. Moab's attempt to use spiritual forces against Israel was foiled by the God of Israel himself. But the story did not end there. Balaam, though unable to curse Israel directly, advised a different tactic, one that would not attack the Israelites from the outside, but would corrupt them from within. And so, the Moabite women began to seduce the men of Israel. They invited them to festivals and sacrifices to their gods. What began as flirtation ended in spiritual collapse. The Israelites ate from the pagan altars and bowed before the idols of Moab, including Baal of Peor. This act of spiritual betrayal ignited God's wrath. A deadly plague broke out in the Israelite camp, killing thousands. The people were dying not because of swords, but because of sin. The corruption had come from within, and it was tearing them apart. It was only when a zealous priest named Phinehas took bold action to stop the sin that the plague ceased. But the damage had been done. This episode was burned into Israel's memory. Moab was no longer just a distant relative or a foreign nation. It was a spiritual threat, a nation that had tried to destroy Israel with seduction rather than war. And from this point on, God gave a direct and severe command. No Moabite could enter the assembly of the Lord, not even to the 10th generation. They were to be cut off from the covenant community. The law was clear. The judgment was final. The Moabites were outcasts, not because of ethnicity, but because of hostility and moral corruption. Their story was a cautionary tale, a reminder that spiritual compromise could destroy a nation from the inside out. The cave of sin had birthed a people destined for rejection. But what Israel didn't know, and what we will see in the chapters to come, is that God never forgets the individual heart. Even in the most cursed bloodline, he can find faith. Even among the rejected, he can spark redemption. The Moabite story wasn't finished. Not yet. And the next chapter would begin with a woman named Ruth. The hostility between Moab and Israel did not erupt in a single battle or one political dispute. It grew steadily, like a smoldering fire fueled by deep spiritual differences and historical tension. Though the Moabites and Israelites shared ancestral roots, both descending from relatives of Abraham, their paths diverged sharply over time. What should have been kinship turned to enmity. And nowhere is this hostility more evident than during Israel's long journey from the wilderness to the Promised Land. After decades of wandering under the leadership of Moses, the Israelites finally approached the edge of Canaan. They arrived near the plains of Moab, tired but hopeful, drawing closer to the land God had promised to their fathers. But what greeted them was not a welcome, nor a gesture of peace. Instead, they met fear, a fear that would spark one of the most infamous spiritual attacks recorded in Scripture. Balak, the king of Moab at that time, had heard of Israel's victories over neighboring kings and cities. He saw them as a threat too large to conquer by conventional warfare. These Israelites were different. They moved with divine backing. Miracles followed them. Enemies fell before them. Balak's fear was not just political. It was spiritual. He believed that Israel's strength lay in their God, and that to defeat them, he needed a way to disrupt their divine protection. So instead of mobilizing his army, Balak sent messengers to summon a seer named Balaam, a prophet known for his ability to bless or curse with supernatural power. Balak's message was urgent. "Come and curse these people for me." He promised Balaam wealth and honor if he would simply speak words that would bring down the Israelites. At first, Balaam hesitated. He knew the God of Israel was not like the gods of other nations. But the promise of riches tempted him. He asked God for permission, and when God initially refused, Balaam persisted. Eventually, God allowed Balaam to go, but with strict instructions to speak only what he permitted. What followed was one of the most mysterious and dramatic episodes in the Bible. As Balaam traveled to meet Balak, his donkey suddenly stopped. Balaam, frustrated, beat the animal. But the donkey, seeing what Balaam could not, refused to move forward because an angel of God stood in the path with a drawn sword. Then, in an act that defies human understanding, the donkey spoke. She questioned Balaam's anger and revealed the divine obstacle. This bizarre moment served as a heavenly warning. Balaam was walking a dangerous line between obedience and rebellion. When Balaam finally arrived, Balak took him to 3 different high places, each with a clear view of the Israelite camp. Each time, Balak hoped the vantage point would give Balaam the spiritual clarity, or the pressure to curse them. But each time Balaam opened his mouth, instead of curses, blessings poured out. He spoke of Israel's future glory, of their strength, of their favor with God. Balak was furious. His plan had failed. No curse could land on a people protected by the hand of God. But even after this spiritual defeat, the danger did not pass. Balaam, though unable to curse Israel directly, advised Balak in a darker, more insidious strategy. If the Moabites could not defeat Israel with words or warfare, perhaps they could destroy them from within through seduction. And so began one of the most tragic downfalls in Israel's history. The Moabite women began to mingle with the men of Israel. What started as innocent interaction soon led to immoral relationships. The women invited the Israelites to their religious feasts, festivals that included the worship of false gods like Baal of Peor. The men not only attended but participated. They ate the pagan sacrifices. They bowed before Moabite idols. They defiled themselves spiritually and physically, breaking covenant with the God who had brought them out of Egypt. God's reaction was swift and terrifying. His anger burned against his people. A deadly plague broke out in the camp, sweeping through like a storm. Thousands of Israelites died, not by swords, but by divine judgment. Israel had not been defeated by the armies of Moab, but by their own spiritual compromise. It was a man named Phinehas, a priest zealous for the holiness of God, who put an end to the plague. When he saw an Israelite man publicly flaunting his immorality with a Midianite woman, Phinehas acted. He took a spear and drove it through both of them, stopping the rebellion in its tracks. His bold act turned away God's wrath, and the plague ceased. But the damage was done. Over 24,000 Israelites had died. This event became more than a tragedy. It became a defining moment in Israel's history. Moab was no longer just a distant nation. They were now seen as a spiritual threat, capable of leading God's people into sin that could destroy them from the inside out. The pain was not just in the loss of life but in the betrayal of trust. Moab had seduced Israel into forsaking their covenant with the living God. From that point forward, the Moabites were no longer viewed as merely neighbors or distant relatives. They were enemies not only in the political sense but in the spiritual realm. Their tactics had bypassed the battlefield and gone straight for the soul. They had uncovered Israel's greatest vulnerability, not in physical warfare, but in moral failure. This deep offense led to a response that would echo through generations. God, through Moses, declared a law that would codify the consequence of Moab's actions. It wasn't simply a punishment, it was a spiritual protection. No Moabite would be allowed to enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. This wasn't about ethnicity, it was about integrity. The Israelites had to remain spiritually distinct. Allowing those who had introduced such corruption into their midst would only lead to ruin. For Israel, the name Moab became a reminder of failure, temptation, and judgment. It reminded them of the danger of compromise, the weight of unfaithfulness, and the need to remain set apart. Moab had not raised a sword, but they had pierced the heart of Israel's identity. And yet, even with such hostility and deep separation, the story of Moab was not yet over. Though they had succeeded in bringing down thousands, and though their actions had resulted in a law of exclusion, the door of redemption had not been completely shut. For in a land marked by seduction and sin, God was preparing a surprising twist, one that would come not through war or power, but through the quiet faith of one woman. But for now, the tension between Moab and Israel stood like a wall, dividing not just two nations but two spiritual paths, one marked by corruption and rebellion, and the other called to holiness and covenant. And from that moment forward, every mention of Moab carried the weight of betrayal and the memory of spiritual war. The aftermath of Moab's seduction of Israel left more than a bitter memory. It became a turning point in how God's people were commanded to deal with their neighbors. Moab's actions at Baal Peor had not only resulted in the death of thousands through a divine plague, but also unveiled the dangerous influence they posed to the spiritual integrity of Israel. It was no longer a matter of borders or politics. It was a matter of survival, not of the body but of the soul. God had to draw a line, and he did so with a decree that would mark the Moabites for generations. As the Israelites stood poised to enter the Promised Land, God spoke through Moses and gave laws meant to protect the future of his chosen people. Among these laws was a divine restriction found in the book of Deuteronomy, a direct response to the betrayal Israel had suffered at the hands of Moab. The command was crystal clear: no Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation none of their descendants shall enter the assembly of the Lord forever. This was no ordinary exclusion. To be barred from the assembly of the Lord meant more than being kept out of social gatherings. It meant being cut off from full covenant membership, from joining the people of God in worship, in inheritance, and in identity. It was a spiritual barrier that said, these people are not welcome to share in the blessings of God's promises. And the words, even to the 10th generation, signified something far beyond a temporary ban. It was symbolic of permanence. It declared a spiritual boundary that would endure. But God, in his justice, did not make this decision without cause. The scriptures explain why this judgment fell on Moab so heavily. The Moabites had not met Israel with hospitality when they emerged from Egypt, weary and vulnerable in the wilderness. They had not offered bread or water, the most basic forms of human kindness. But worse still, they had conspired against God's people, attempting to destroy them not by sword, but by summoning a curse. They had hired Balaam to speak destruction over Israel. And when that failed, they turned to seduction and spiritual corruption, leading the men of Israel into idolatry. This wasn't just a political offense, it was a direct spiritual assault. The Moabites hadn't only attacked Israel, they had insulted the God who protected them. Their refusal to show kindness, their manipulation through Balaam, and their spiritual treachery at Baal Peor were not forgotten. These acts struck at the very core of what it meant to be a holy people set apart for God. Therefore, the divine law served two purposes. It was both a consequence and a shield. First, it was a righteous response to Moab's wickedness. Second, it was a safeguard to keep Israel from falling again. By preventing Moabites from entering the assembly, God was preserving the purity of his covenant community. He was ensuring that the spiritual rot that once brought death to thousands would never again be allowed to fester within the camp. This law, harsh as it seemed, reflected the seriousness of Israel's calling. They were to be different from every nation, holy, obedient, and loyal to Yahweh alone. And that meant protecting themselves from influences that would pull them back into the bondage of sin. God was not acting out of prejudice. He was acting out of purpose. Israel had a mission: to be a light to the nations, a people through whom the Messiah would one day come. And nothing, not even ancient family ties, could be allowed to jeopardize that. The law was also a reminder. Israel's identity was sacred, and not even close blood relations could guarantee inclusion. The Moabites were descendants of Lot, Abraham's nephew. Their ancestry traced back to the same extended family. But shared blood did not equate to shared covenant. The standard was not human connection, it was spiritual loyalty. And the Moabites had proven, time and again, to be enemies of that loyalty. So the ban stood as a solemn declaration. Moab's origin in sin, their actions of hostility, and their success in corrupting God's people had disqualified them. They were not to be integrated. They were to be kept at a distance. The memory of Baal of Peor remained a cautionary tale engraved into the law of Moses. It warned every generation of Israelites that the most dangerous enemies are not always those who come with swords, but those who come with smiles and foreign gods. This divine restriction shaped Israel's worldview. It affected how they saw foreigners, how they guarded their worship, and how they interpreted God's justice. It was a legal boundary rooted in spiritual warfare. For centuries, it seemed like the matter was settled. Moab had been judged. The door was shut, the law was clear, and the people of Moab stood outside the covenant with no path back in. But what Israel didn't yet see, and what even the law could not fully explain, was that God's justice and God's mercy are not in conflict. They are two sides of His perfect will. And while the law declared exclusion, grace was preparing a different path, one that would not ignore sin, but would transform the sinner. The divine ban on Moabites was real, but it was not the final word. For in the heart of a foreign woman yet to be introduced, a spark of faith would arise. A faith so pure, so bold, and so loyal, that it would one day walk straight through the wall the law had built, not by breaking it, but by fulfilling its deeper purpose. And when that day came, everything Israel thought they knew about grace, law, and redemption would be turned upside down. In the long shadow of the divine ban on the Moabites, it would have seemed impossible for one of them to ever be counted among the people of God again. The law was explicit. The barrier was firm. The memory of Moab's treachery, of seduction, of idolatry, and of death lingered heavy over the nation of Israel. For generations, this command stood as a warning. The Moabites were unfit to join the covenant community. Their name, their lineage, their very origin was stained by sin. But in one of the most unexpected turns in the entire biblical narrative, God reached into that very place of rejection and raised up a woman whose faith would silence centuries of shame. Her name was Ruth. The story of Ruth begins not in triumph, but in tragedy. During the time of the Judges, a period marked by chaos, disobedience, and spiritual drift, a severe famine struck the land of Israel. In the city of Bethlehem, a man named Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their 2 sons made a desperate decision. They left the land of promise and sought survival in the land of Moab, the very place they were taught to avoid. Moab was the land of Israel's spiritual enemies, a place cut off from the assembly of the Lord. And yet, that is where this Israelite family chose to settle. What followed was a series of heartbreaks. Elimelech died in Moab. His 2 sons married Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth, but after about a decade, the sons also died, leaving Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law widowed, childless, and with no future. For Naomi, the pain was unbearable. She had left Bethlehem full and returned empty. Her husband was gone. Her sons were gone. All she had left were 2 Moabite daughters-in-law, and a heart full of bitterness. Upon hearing that the famine in Israel had ended, Naomi resolved to return to Bethlehem. But before leaving, she turned to Orpah and Ruth and urged them to go back to their families. She had nothing to offer them, no sons, no dowry, no home. Orpah wept, kissed Naomi goodbye, and walked away. But Ruth did something extraordinary. She refused to leave. In a moment of pure devotion, Ruth spoke words that would echo across history. "Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if anything but death separates me from you." These were not empty words. This was not polite loyalty. Ruth, a Moabite, was making a covenant. She was renouncing her homeland, her family, her culture, and her gods, especially the worship of Chemosh, the national god of Moab. She was turning her back on everything she knew to follow the God of Israel. In doing so, She made the same kind of faith decision that Abraham had made when he left his homeland to follow a call from God. But unlike Abraham, Ruth was doing so with no promise, no voice from heaven, no assurance, just loyalty, faith, and love. This single act shattered the assumptions Israel held about the Moabites. The divine ban had condemned the nation for its actions and its influence, but Ruth showed that individuals could choose a different path. Her identity was no longer defined by her ancestry, but by her faith. She stepped out of the curse and into covenant, voluntarily, sacrificially, and humbly. When Ruth and Naomi arrived in Bethlehem, the entire town stirred with whispers. A Moabite had returned with Naomi? A woman from the cursed nation now walked the streets of Israel's holy city? But Ruth didn't come seeking attention. She came seeking to serve, to provide for Naomi. She went out to glean in the fields, picking up leftover grain after the harvesters had passed. It was humble, difficult work, but she did it without complaint. By divine providence, Ruth ended up in the field of a man named Boaz, a wealthy landowner and a relative of Naomi's late husband. Boaz quickly noticed Ruth, not just her beauty or her presence, but her character. He had heard of her loyalty to Naomi, her sacrifice, and her courage. He saw in her something rare: integrity, humility, and strength. Boaz extended kindness to Ruth, offering her protection, food, and favor. When Ruth reported all of this to Naomi, the older woman recognized God's hand at work. She realized Boaz was a kinsman redeemer, a close relative with the legal right to redeem the family's land and marry the widow of a deceased relative, thus continuing the family line. Naomi instructed Ruth to approach Boaz with a culturally significant request, that he fulfill this role of redeemer. Ruth, once again demonstrating courage and trust, went to Boaz by night, laid herself at his feet in submission, and asked him to spread his cloak over her, a symbol of protection, marriage, and redemption. Boaz responded with honor and respect. He marveled at Ruth's faith, her dignity, and her desire to preserve Naomi's family. He agreed to redeem her, though he first ensured that all legal obligations were met. Boaz did not rush into this because of emotion. He did it through the proper channels, respecting the laws of Israel and the rights of others. And when all was resolved, Boaz married Ruth. The foreign woman from the cursed nation became not just his wife, but a full member of the covenant community. Their union bore a son named Obed. Obed became the father of Jesse. Jesse became the father of David, the greatest king Israel ever knew. Ruth the Moabite, the woman who had no place among God's people by law, was grafted not just into the nation of Israel but into the royal line that would eventually lead to Jesus Christ himself. This story reveals the depth of God's mercy. The divine ban on Moabites was not a life sentence for every individual. The law existed to protect the covenant community from those who actively rebelled against God and sought to corrupt his people. But Ruth showed that when a heart turns in faith and humility, God's grace opens doors the law alone could not. Ruth's story is a declaration that God sees beyond bloodlines and national identity. He sees the heart. He honors faith, humility, and loyalty. Her life stands as proof that one woman's choice to follow God, despite her background, can change the course of history. In a field in Bethlehem, the curse of Moab was broken not by power or law, but by a converted heart and a redeemer who chose to restore what was once lost. And in Ruth, the world caught a glimpse of what God would one day do for all nations. Redeem outsiders, embrace the rejected, and write a new story, not based on the failures of the past, but on the power of faith and the mystery of grace. The story of Ruth did not end with her redemption and marriage to Boaz. It was only just beginning. What began as tragedy in a foreign land became a divine turnaround so profound that it would ripple through generations and shake the very foundations of Israel's understanding of grace, lineage, and the heart of God. Ruth's name, once associated with a cursed people, would become etched into the most sacred genealogy in human history, the ancestry of the Messiah. To the people of Israel, Ruth should have remained an outsider. She was a Moabite, a descendant of Lot through an incestuous union. Her nation had tried to curse and corrupt God's people. She came from a people who worshipped false gods and practiced detestable rites. She bore the shame of centuries of hostility and spiritual defilement. And yet, by choosing faith, loyalty, and submission to Yahweh, Ruth stepped into a story far bigger than herself. Her son, Obed, born through the union with Boaz, was not just a continuation of a family line. He was a sign, a divine statement that God could redeem what was rejected, restore what was broken, and honor those the world dismissed. Obed grew up in the soil of Bethlehem, a town that would later become synonymous with promise and salvation. He would raise Jesse, and Jesse would raise David, the shepherd boy turned king, the man after God's own heart. In a way no one could have foreseen, the Moabite woman who once gleaned leftovers in the fields of Israel became the great-grandmother of King David. And from David's line would come the Savior of the world, Jesus Christ. This was not a coincidence. It was divine orchestration. God was showing, long before the Gospels were ever written, that his redemptive plan would not be limited by ancestry, race, law, or shame. Ruth's presence in the genealogy of Christ is not a footnote. It is a declaration. A woman from a people under divine ban was not only welcomed but exalted. Her story was engraved into the bloodline of the one who would redeem all mankind. The Gospel of Matthew, which opens the New Testament, does something incredibly intentional. In its first chapter, Matthew traces the lineage of Jesus and includes Ruth by name. In a time when genealogies often excluded women altogether, Matthew deliberately makes her known. He reminds every reader that the Savior came not just through kings and prophets, but through outcasts and foreigners who dared to believe. Ruth's inclusion in this sacred list proclaims a message to all generations. The grace of God reaches further than law, deeper than heritage, and higher than shame. She became the bridge between the Old Covenant and the New Promise, a Gentile woman whose faith opened the door for every nation to be brought into the family of God. Her legacy is not just historical, it is theological. Ruth's life foreshadowed the church, the body of believers from every tribe and tongue who, like her, once stood far from the promises of God. Through Christ, who is our Boaz, we too are brought near, not by birthright, but by grace through faith. Ruth came from Moab. We come from brokenness, sin, and separation. And yet, just as Ruth was redeemed and restored, we too are invited into God's eternal family, from outcast to matriarch, from cursed to chosen, from gleaning barley to bearing royal blood. Ruth's journey is not just her story. It is the story of redemption itself, a story that continues to unfold in every heart that turns from idols to the living God, that chooses faith over fear, and that dares to believe that grace is greater than our past. Ruth the Moabite became Ruth the mother of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, Jesse the father of David, and from David's line came Jesus, our Redeemer. In Ruth's story, we are reminded that the love of God is not confined by the failures of man. He chooses the least likely. He lifts the lowly. He breaks through the boundaries we thought were fixed. And he writes redemption into the lives of those willing to trust him, no matter where they come from.